Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hi, it's James Taylor here. Today's episode was first aired as part of International Authors Summit. This inspiring virtual summit reveals the secrets of making, marketing, and monetizing a best-selling book. If you would like to access the full video version as well as in-depth sessions with over 40 best-selling authors, then I've got a very special offer for you. Just go to internationalauthorssummit.com where you'll be able to register for a free pass for the summit. Yeah, that's right. Over 40 New York Times and Amazon best-selling authors, book editors, agents, and publishers sharing their insights, strategies, and tactics on how to write and market your first or next bestseller. So just go to internationalauthorssummit.com, but not before you listen to today's episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to welcome David Burkus. David Burkus is a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, and associate professor of leadership and innovation at Oral Roberts University. His latest book, Friend of a Friend, offers readers a new perspective on how to grow their networks and build key connections, one based on the science of human behavior, not rote networking advice. He's delivered keynotes to the leaders of Fortune 500 companies and the future leaders of the United States Naval Academy. His TED Talk has been viewed over 1.8 million times, and he is a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review. It's my great pleasure having David join us today. So welcome, David.
Oh, James, thank you so much for having me.
So share with everyone what's happening in your world just now.
Life is good. So we are, at the time of recording this, we're a couple months out from the launch of Friend of a Friend, which was my third real book, let's say. And so it's been really fun. We're at that point where I'm getting seeing pictures on Twitter and Instagram of people who've read the book and what have you. Like literally just yesterday I got an email from a college class that read the book as part of one of their business courses. I thought that was unexpected and kind of.
I think I maybe saw that one on Twitter, but everyone kind of standing there with their copies of the book.
Yeah. It's really kind of cool. So that's, for an author, for a writer, it's stuff like that is super rewarding. So it's just kind of the push of trying to talk about the book all the time and get the message out there is starting to sort of compound, and people are responding, and that's what's really fun. That's when it gets really fun.
Now, I'm sure your books are in various kind of airport bookstores as well, when people are kind of traveling around the world. Have you had the thing yet? I was speaking to another author the other day, and he was saying he had his first experience of being on a plane, and the person sitting next to him had a copy of his book. And he was in that kind of slightly what do I do? What do I say, Chai? So I asked him how they enjoying the book, or what they think of the book, or is that a double-edged sword? So has that experience happened to you yet?
So I haven't had that in an airport or something like that. I've had something similar happen kind of at conferences. Like you go give a speech and they usually bundle a bunch of books in, and so then what's really funny is if you're like the closing keynote for the day. Right, the book was in their swag bag, so you see people sort of thumbing through it, and they don't know who you are yet because you haven't spoken. So you just kind of walk up to them. That's happened a couple times. The plane thing still has not. However, I have gotten text messages from friends of mine who will take their phone and take a little shot secretly of somebody reading the book and send it over to me. That's been kind of cool.
So tell everyone, where did the writing part begin for you? Because I know obviously you're a speaker, you work in kind of academia as well, but take us back to that very first book. Tell us a story about that.
Well, for me, it actually kind of goes a little bit further back than that. So I knew much about my career is very accidental, but I knew that I wanted to be a writer from about 14 years old. So I was English in high school and things where that was the subject that really resonated with me. I was that kid that was reading beat up copies of Jack Kerouac and that kind of thing, which it's funny. I reread On the Road maybe a year ago, and I definitely liked it more when I was 14, 15. But when you're that young, you think that means you're going to be a fiction writer. You think that means, okay, am I going to be an artistic novelist and do literary fiction, or am I going to sell out like James Patterson but make money, right? That's the big existential dilemma. So I arrived at university to study English and to study writing. And it was there that you kind of got exposed to a lot of different genres. And this was right around the time where social science books stopped being boring, right? So this was people like Malcolm Gladwell, Chip and Dan Heath, Daniel Pink, their sort of first books were coming out. In fact, I remember I think I was a junior, third year in university when The Tipping Point came out. And I remember reading it and being like, this is fascinating. And this guy's every bit as good a storyteller as a fiction writer, right? So that was sort of a pivot for me to think like, oh, this is what I want to do. So when I got out, I realized I studied this writing and the storytelling part, but I don't know any of social science. So I went to graduate school for that. I was actually working in a totally different industry, but lots of different economic changes happened in university life because I had already had a master's degree and half of a doctorate was sort of the great place to like land while I was building up the platform to write the first book, et cetera. So all of the other things, speaking, being a professor, et cetera, were sort of tangential to that big overarching goal of getting books out there. I mean, literally like probably a decade worth of wanting to walk into a Barnes & Noble one day or a Chapters or a W.H. Smith and see my book there, which finally happened 10 years later. But it's been a while. It's been a while for sure.
But that's interesting. I mean, the way you described it there, we've had some other guests on that have talked about how they're speakers who write as opposed to writers who speak. And for some of them, really, the book is a business card. It's a tool to get them speaking gigs primarily. They don't particularly enjoy writing. It's not an enjoyable experience for them. But they know they need to get books out there every couple of years in order to stay relevant as well. But it sounds like you're very much you've kind of chosen the harder path. Because your books are more obviously research driven as well. So you have to these are not kind of things you can get a ghostwriter in to do.
Yeah. I would never hire a ghostwriter because for me that would be not being a writer, right? Like I respect that model and that point of view. I also kind of hate that model and that point of view because I think it steals attention away from sort of the writers who also speak. But far be it for me to tell anybody how to run their life or their business, right? But I think you hit the nail on the head that I think everybody kind of becomes one or the other. You're either a writer who supplements writing income by traveling around and speaking, and by the way, speaking pays better for almost all of us, or you say, I'm a speaker or I'm a consultant first, and this is my marketing tool. I can't really connect with that because the goal has always been the writing. Now, I will tell you that I have hated writing the first draft of pretty much every book that I've written. I love the research part where I'm like learning and playing around with these concepts and figuring out like what's the structure of the argument, right? And I love the editing and I love the marketing side, but actually like having to show up for work every day and type out 500 to 1,000 words, that part I don't know anybody that likes.
This is the backside on the chair bit of the process. So as you kind of knew that you mentioned Malcolm Gladwell and how the social sciences started to come into things. Who were were there other kind of mentors that you had when you were first starting to move into the world of writing, people that maybe kind of helped you knew personally that would help kind of support you in that journey, or were there people that you kind of looked at from afar and kind of very much tracked how they had built their writing and their speaking and everything around it?
Yeah. So, I mean, mentor is a strong word. I think it implies the kind of like we meet every week for coffee, right? We Tuesdays with Maury or something like that. I definitely didn't have that. I would say I probably had two things. The first was that when I realized, okay, this is the genre, this is the style of book that I want, I started devising a way to get in touch with my heroes, right? And for me, because this was 10 years ago, that was a podcast. Now podcasting is sort of like the garage band. Everybody has one now, right? And so I don't know that this trick would work. You'd have to find a different medium. But I was the 47th business-related podcast on iTunes, right? Because just it was wide open space. You had to be fairly tech savvy to figure it all out. And I was young and could figure all of that out. And so I started inviting people to come on my podcast because nobody knew what this world was about. Nobody knew that no one was listening to the show yet, right? And so we probably recorded 4 or 5 interviews before the first one aired and there was anyone actually listening to the show. But the very second episode was Daniel Pink, who remains kind of the template, the role model in my mind. And Dan and I have become friendly ever since then, and it's been really, really useful. Again, I wouldn't call him a mentor, right? He's a role model for sure, and he's somebody that I can bounce a couple questions off. In terms of that mentorship role, I think that's kind of the importance of peers, finding people who are around the same stage, a few people ahead, a few people behind, but mostly peers to run around with that. That kind of works better for refining your craft and learning a bit more. I mean, don't get me wrong. It'd be great if like Malcolm Gladwell called me from his place in New York and said, I want a Skype call with you every week and develop you as a writer. But it's kind of hard to get those people to do that. And so a peer group is a much more useful resource in that context.
So tell us about that. You mentioned the kind of the importance of the research, and that's a stage you really enjoy when you're working on your books. How do you structure your research? What talk us through when let's say if you have maybe a kernel of an idea in your head, how do you go about starting to research that? What are the ways that you're collecting, you're kind of segmenting up all this information that you're bringing together?
Yeah, so there's a really good LinkedIn article from Adam Grant that borrows from an actual social science article. I don't remember the name of the original author, which is a tragedy because it's his work. But he essentially studied what ideas are sticky. This was before the Heaths or before Jonah Berger, et cetera. And he said that at least in like nonfiction, in arguments, in the social science world, the arguments that gain traction, get citations, et cetera, they all follow a very unique format, which is basically we think this, but really this, right? And if you think about every what we could call social science, enjoyable nonfiction, business books, whatever. I like to call them the big idea books, right? Yeah. All of those books follow that format, right? We think this, but really it's this. Now that can take a couple different trends. Like we could say, we think something is a macro trend, but really it's a micro trend, or vice versa. We think something is small and individual, but really everybody's being influenced by each other. You look at like to pick on a Gladwell, right? Outliers. We think success is the result of sort of pure nothing but hard work, but actually it's that plus a bunch of different opportunities, and the way that the system is structured kind of picks the winners, and so we need to refine the system, right? That's outliers. Grant, give and take is the same way, right? We think nice guys finish last, but actually they finish last and first, and it's the takers that occupy the middle, right? So every book kind of follows that. So that's what I'm looking for first, right? What is we think this, but really there is a wealth of research that suggests something else. Right. And so now I'm providing a different way to kind of look at it. My books tend to follow. I once had a negative Amazon review. This was before I decided to stop reading all Amazon reviews. But I once had a negative Amazon review that said, this book reads like a series of Medium articles. And I thought, actually, that's a compliment, because that's the exact structure that I want, right? I want an intro chapter or two that introduces you to the argument, and then I want a bunch of individually, essentially essays that all are in line with that argument, but teaching you about different things, right, and different phenomena, so you're sort of seeing it. I like it that way. I think a lot of people structure their books such that you can read the first 2 or 3 chapters and you can get it, right, and then the rest is just filler. I like to think that mine can be that, because the argument is usually in the first chapter, plus a bunch of different contexts for seeing it. So I'm not just rehashing the argument, I'm showing the argument in a bunch of different areas. So people actually read to the end, which is I don't know, I like it. There are some books that have that you can get the whole thing in the first 2 chapters and never have to read beyond it, that sell better than I do, but I don't think they're as enjoyable to read. And they certainly probably weren't as enjoyable to write. That's why those people hired ghostwriters. So
you find that you've kind of got that core, like the counterintuitive, maybe the contrarian view of something. I think the writer Patrick Schwerdtfeger, he was saying whenever he gives a speech, he always wants to give that the bit. It's almost like in a song, you'll have the middle 8. It's the bit where you can, like, everyone thinks it's going in one way, and then you kind of like pivot a little bit, and it's like, oh, I didn't kind of expect that thing. It's kind of unexpected. So you kind of know what that thing is, and then you've kind of then got to start backfilling and supporting that argument and finding the stories and finding the examples. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about starting to research and finding those things to support your argument?
Yeah, so it varies, right? It really varies by book. So my first book was around creativity and innovation. That's how we met. And I had the science first, right? I had all of these different studies that outlined all of these different alternative ways of looking at creativity. And so then I had to go out and research the stories, right? For Under New Management, which was my second book, I had the stories. I had the profiles of companies, but I had to go find the science. Friend of a Friend, the newest one, is back to the Myths of Creativity route, where we have the science and then we have to go find the stories. The science is probably easier to find because everybody cites everybody and you can kind of go down a rabbit hole. You find one paper that's in line with your argument and suddenly you've got a wealth of stuff to look up in the citations. The stories are a bit harder. I try and sort of always be looking for those. Like I'll give you an example. The Winter Olympics just happened a couple months back, maybe actually probably half a year back by now. And one of the stories that we kept talking about in the United States was curling, believe it or not. Now, curling is actually like a boring but oddly mesmerizing sport. I don't know if you've ever watched it. You start out like, what is this? And an hour later, you're still watching it. But the U.S. won the curling medal. And the team captain of USA Curling was actually a guy who got thrown out of USA Curling and started his own kind of like club that was going to train and compete for the right to represent the U.S. again because now they hadn't been chosen. And they did. And then they went and won the gold medal. That's a really cool story. So when it happened, I basically bookmarked it, printed out every article I could find about that, and threw it in a drawer somewhere. And I remember that story because it's the top of a stack of a lot of different stuff. But that's kind of what I'm doing, is always trying to collect those stories so that it's not like starting from scratch. I can go, well, the next thing's probably going to be in and around teams, and this is a great team story, so let me file this one away, right? And then you go back and look through your files, and probably half of them turn out to be junk or actually a bogus story that some publicist ran, right? But you find ones that actually stick, and it can be really interesting.
Now, writers like Ryan Holiday or Robert Greene, they'll kind of use the kind of index card way of kind of collecting all those stories, and then they're kind of moving them kind of physically about, I guess. Other people use things like Scrivener for kind of moving these things about and kind of structuring them. When it comes to you actually kind of sitting down and then actually structuring out the whole, you mentioned that kind of medium type of format in terms of how are you thinking in terms of the overarching kind of narrative of a book and how you structure your books?
Yeah, so I don't use note cards. I've worked closely. Ryan's a good friend, and I still have no idea how he does the note cards thing because I need the whole article, right? Yeah. So what I will do is, I'm printing out. I actually kill a lot of trees, and I feel bad about that. But most paper is sustainably sourced now, so it's okay. I print up, if it's an article, I print that up. If it's in a book, I actually photocopy those pages, and I have the pages, right? The 8 and 11 or A4 paper in a big stack. Usually then you organize by chapter, right? So this story kind of works with this chapter, so it goes in a pile over here. And you can actually tell. So the bookshelf behind me, along the floor of it when I'm writing a book, is like 12 different stacks of paper. Right? And the only note cards that I use are actually a note card on top of the stack that tells me what chapter that is, right? So then I go through and I'll highlight what I like and I'll make margin notes and that sort of thing. And the writing, the act of typing, is the act of going through that stack. In terms of the internal structure of a chapter, there's usually, like a Medium article type of thing, there's usually an opening story that sort of draws you in, a thesis, some research that explains that story and that thesis. And then what Dan Pink actually challenged me to do in writing this last book was to be a bit more prescriptive. So now each one also ends with like, okay, and if all of this is true, this is what this means for you. Yeah. Which I think that's one of the reasons this one's resonating more, but that's kind of the structure of each chapter, but it starts with those stacks of paper.
And I think that point there, I think that's really good that you put that in the book, because that can frustrate me about some of those social science books. It's obviously written by people who really cared passionately about the science behind it and have done all that stuff, and you do have stories within it, but at the end you kind of want them to say, and this is kind of what you should do next. If you're a such and such, this is your next step. And I always kind of feel like it's kind of going to a meal and never quite getting to the main course, or it's you feel kind of unsatisfied. So I love the fact that he challenged you. You did that on the book. You kind of gave some of those slightly more prescriptive things, because I know some more kind of academic writers would try and steer away from that because that's not what they're about, not what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and this is actually exactly what we found with Friend of a Friend, right? So there's a grand thesis of Friend of a Friend, but the inspiration for the book was that there are all of these networking advice books on here's how to do something, very prescriptive, and they're not based in research. And then on the rare occasion that someone that's actually studied network science writes a popular press book, the main argument of the book is something to the effect of, isn't this fascinating? Look at everything that we've discovered, right? And it is fascinating, but what do I do about that, right? And that's where I've really started to see people like myself, like Dan, like others, the sort of social science writers. Now, I keep one foot in academia, but I really see my goal as translating that isn't it fascinating research into and here's what it means for your life.
So when it comes to authors, I mean, I highly encourage people to get their copy of a friend of a friend. Is there any particular things that you found in kind of researching and writing that book you think particularly applies to authors, maybe in their researching of something, or in terms of how they market and sell and get the book out into the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give you two, right? The first is that we're in terms of writing, we're in a really interesting point. If you work in an organization, we're in this like 30-year arc towards trying to tear down silos and build flatter, more matrixed organizations. And one of the things that we find from network science is that people cluster. Clustering happens naturally. And that's a good thing because information flows a bit more freely inside of a cluster than if everybody was sort of egalitarianly connected to everybody else. Too much clustering is a bad thing, but like don't ignore it. Now, what I think that means for writers is like you need to find who is your cluster, who is your community of similar writers that are around you. My friend Jeff Goins would call it your scene, right? And actually Jeff was the one that told me about sort of the whole story of Ernest Hemingway going off to Paris and meeting with a bunch of people there and becoming, I mean, you know, running around having drinks with Pablo Picasso and Gertrude Stein and all these people. Picasso, not Picasso, that was a weird slip. And it made him a better writer. And I think we all sort of need that. So clustering, don't ignore that. And the beautiful thing is in technology, you can have that cluster whether it's in person or virtual. The other thing I think is really interesting from a marketing standpoint is network science. One of the most fascinating findings is this thing called the majority illusion. Essentially, you know, we're tribal people. All of us take our cues off of what's popular and what's interesting based on what other people are talking about, right? And if that's true, then word of mouth is important, but it's possible to sort of fake word of mouth. If you pick your demographic, I'm going after these specific people, then you can kind of study that network and build relationships with who are the most influential people in that network. And rather than try and be everywhere all at once, you can really drill down into just those people, and you can look far more popular than you are. And in the book, I actually talk about Tim Ferriss, nonfiction writer amongst a bunch of other stuff that he does, but he's had five crazy successful books. The first one, though, nobody knew who he was. What he did was he identified, I'm going after 18 to 35-year-old tech-savvy males. What are the blogs that they read? Who are the people that they trust? What are the companies that admire? And he spent 2 years building relationships with the people that were influential in that little niche so that when the book came out, those people were talking about it. And if you were an 18 to 35-year-old tech-savvy male, which I was at the time that he launched this book, he appeared everywhere. Yeah. And if you weren't one of those people, you didn't know who he was. Like there are still people who don't know who Tim Ferriss is because they're not in one of the verticals that he's chosen to target. And it's one thing to pick your niche. It's a whole other thing to go, okay, now that I know the niche, who are the people that I need to build relationships with that'll support me when this comes out and make the book look like everyone is talking about it, even if they're not.
Yeah, that kind of idea, the kind of crowding, almost like kind of crowding round when something's happening. We had Hugh MacLeod on this, and Hugh kind of came up around the same time as Tim, with both bloggers, when blogs were kind of in their infancy. And kind of everyone would be kind of go to blog world, and they all kind of got to know each other, and it kind of speaks to also your cluster. You know, he said there was a whole bunch of us. We all kind of came, Chris Brogan. You know, they all kind of came around the same time. They all kind of came up together, really. And then obviously some have gone on to great things. But I think that's a fantastic strategy to use if you kind of know your audience. And there's another one Ryan Holiday's actually spoken about. I remember interviewing him years ago for his book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. Secrets of a Media Manipulator, which is a fantastic book. And he talks all about that. He said it's actually quite simple to find out who that New York Times journalist, which blogs they follow, which Twitter accounts they follow, and then start to influence those. And then they kind of lead on to each other. And suddenly it feels like everyone's talking about this Tim Ferriss guy or this other one, because you're kind of crowding around actually a relatively small number of people.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I was just putting this into practice I was on the phone maybe a week ago with a friend of mine that started a charity. I won't name him in case this doesn't work, but a pretty notable worldwide charity. He's launching a book at the end of this year, early next year, and we were talking about podcasts. And one of the things that he said, which was brilliant, was he said, no, I don't want to know what all of the ones are. I want to know what the 20 I have to be on are to make the 63 million people who listen to podcasts think, wow, everyone is talking about me, right? Yeah. Which is totally possible to do. And in a world of technology, like Ryan was saying, it's even easier to find that out because you go to their Twitter and you can see who they follow, right? Or go to their Medium or go to their Facebook, whatever it is. You can see pretty clearly who everyone's taking their cues from. Here's the kicker, though. Don't then just go spam those people. Make a deliberate effort to build a real relationship with those people. Help them so that when that time comes that it's time for you to do your thing, they're eager and excited to talk about you. And suddenly everyone who's watching them is like, man, this James Taylor guy's everywhere.
And I guess that's one of the other part of your life is the speaking. And I think one of the best places to do that is still at live events. It's great. I love online. I love doing things and communicating online, email, and we're doing online just now as well. But there's nothing like having that conversation with someone, especially if you're like in a green room, you're speaking and they're speaking, or you're having a conversation, you're doing a book signing. Being able to have those kind of conversations is like it's a different type of thing. You're having completely different conversations.
Yeah, totally. And I'll even try and level that up and say, okay, I'm speaking in this city. Even if they're not in the conference, I'm not going to see it in the green room, what have you. Like, who do I know that's in this city that I need to reconnect with?
Yeah.
Right. And I'll make it like I'll usually land on the first available airplane into that new city, and I'll leave as late as I possibly can on the day that I have to leave to maximize that time to sort of reconnect with those people. I can sleep on the plane, right? But to maximize my time reconnecting with those people, because what we found, and I deal with this a bit in Friend of a Friend, is that online communities and networks are fantastic, but they are a supplement to, not a replacement for your existing offline network. You've got to take it offline eventually.
Now, having gone through this journey of writing all these different books now, was there a key aha moment or light bulb moment, a time when you said, okay, actually, I want to tweak the direction I'm going with my writing, or I want to serve maybe a slightly different audience, or the books need to serve a slightly different purpose for me now than when I first started writing?
I mean, not in terms of changing a book or something like that. Probably one of the best insights that I got was actually from Ryan Holiday. I was on a call with him at some point, and we were talking about a bunch of stuff and kind of what the authors that take it seriously and you can see slow and consistent growth over time, right? Which is what you want to be. I mean, it'd be great if you can be one of those authors that Oprah picks and you sell 1 million copies, but you can't plan for that, right? And you can't sit around and hope for it. So the only logical path is to be that one that slowly builds an audience over time. And one of the things Ryan said is, he goes, what people get hung up on is that the job of being a writer is not to write a book all the time and occasionally step out into the world and market it. The job of a writer is to constantly be marketing yourself and your ideas, and occasionally you introduce a new book into that. And so it's been about a year of really kind of thinking about that first, like my personal platform, audience, the community that's around me. It's probably more important to spend time cultivating that than worrying about writing the perfect book. It's never going to be the perfect book. There's stuff in my first book that is out of date now. There's stuff in the book I just wrote that I wish I could rewrite. I mean, one guy, I wrote a profile of Jordan Harbinger, one of the best podcasters of all time, and he changed the name of his show and broke up with his business partners right in between publication, right? So, but I can't control that, right?
Yeah.
The one thing I can control is, okay, I need to build this community of people around me, the Kevin Kelly 1,000 true fans type of idea. That's the real job. And then occasionally you introduce content into those people.
Yeah, I mean, even another guest we had on this event was David Allen. And David Allen, he consistently wants to do one podcast interview a week, which is promoting a book, Getting Things Done, which was written, quite a few years ago, and there's new versions of it as well, and he's adding new books as well. But he said you just need, it's a consistency, as you were saying, and as Ryan was saying, it's a consistency thing, rather than just you write the book and you just kind of go into that 1 to 3 months of promotion and then forget it, and I'm going to move on to the next thing. It's a bit of a marathon in that way.
No, exactly right.
So we talked about a little bit earlier about some tools and things. Are there any other tools that you use that help you particularly when you're writing? Do you write on a particular app on your computer, or are there things that help you organize your information?
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned Scrivener. I imagine half of the people, if not more, that you're interviewing use Scrivener. I hope they're sponsoring this because we're giving them a lot of love. Yeah. If not. I find it a really great app for first drafts because you can move stuff around, but really it's the word count tracking feature that does it for me, right? You tell it, okay, I need this many words by this day, and I write on these days of the week. And when you show up for work in the morning and boot up your computer and boot up the app, it'll go, hey, good morning, you've got to write 575 words today to stay on pace. And then when you hit that word count, it'll give you this really satisfying little ding, right? that is fantastic, right? And so that to me is the most useful source of it. So I love it as a first draft tool. I'm old school though. When we get into editing and stuff, like track changes in Word is still kind of one of the best ways to go back and forth on a document with your editor. I know there's some functionality like Google Docs that makes it easier because now you're not emailing the file back and forth, but I don't think the commenting features and that kind of stuff work as well, right? So yeah, I write in Scrivener, I edit in Word, and those are probably the two apps that are the most open on my computer, besides social media when I'm trying to prevent myself from writing because I'm feeling the resistance, which every writer spends time on, right? So yeah.
And what about a book? If there was one book that you'd recommend to someone on the craft or the business, the marketing of writing, what would that book be?
So Ryan actually has a great book that came out last year called Perennial Seller. It's not a book on how to write well. It's not even a book on how to market. It's a book on questions you've got to get answered before you start making your work so that you give it the best chance of success. Again, I mean, Ryan will tell you, like, there is still a need for that magic fairy dust if you want to be the 1 million copy seller. But it's possible to be I don't sell a lot, but I sell 10,000 copies a year, and that's a great living, right? So if you're going to do that, there's a lot of questions and things you've got to think through. And so that's a really solid read on that one. That's probably the most current one that I'd recommend. Of course, like I have a beat up copy of Strunk and White somewhere because I'm always wondering what the proper use of a semicolon is and all that kind of stuff. But Ryan's has been a really influential one this past year.
That is an amazing book. We've had a number of our guests that have mentioned that book as being very influential to them as well. So I'm going to leave you with a final thing. I'm going to take away all these books that you've written in the past, and we're going to go back to ground zero with it, and we're going to have to start again. No one knows who you are. You know no one. You have no platform. What would you do? How would you get especially your kind of writing back up again? How would you get publishing again?
Yeah, so I probably couldn't start a podcast the way I did now because it's such a crowded medium. But I would look for some way to invite people that I respect and admire in to create content. That might be video series now. That might be summits. That might be something like that. And the other thing that I would do is I would focus on, I didn't have time to get into it, but I think all of us that write nonfiction sort of trade up the chain in terms of we write for wherever, articles for wherever will have us, and then we try and write for bigger and bigger and bigger places. So I would probably have to start that cycle over again. Thankfully, if I have the knowledge I have now, just not the platform, you could do it in a much shorter period of time because now I know which ones are a waste of time. But that's really the thing, right? You start writing somewhere. If no other place, then you start on like Medium, and then you beg to be a part of people's publications. And then if something gets popular there, you shift it off to Business Insider and you go, hey, this was really viral over here. Would you like an adapted article? And then you kind of crawl up the chain, and eventually you find yourself writing for like HBR or Quartz or something like that. And now you've got an audience. And now the only job is making sure that you capture some amount of them so they come back for your next piece of work.
Now, if people want to connect with you to learn more about, Friend of a Friend is a great book, so I would highly recommend people check that out. But if they want to learn more about your other books, your speaking, the other things that you've kind of got going on, your podcast, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
Yeah, so davidburkus.com is probably the easiest. It's a hard name to spell, but James, I'm sure there's like a link here or like over here somewhere. I'm not sure. Yeah, there you go.
It'll be somewhere.
Right. It'll be somewhere right there. I'm sure there's a link to that. So click over to that. That's probably the best place to start. From there, we can go on social if that's your thing. There's email right there. There's a bunch of resources about the book that if you want to check out, articles adapted from it, etc., before you take the leap. But I hope you take the leap and grab a copy because I think it'll be quite useful, especially if you're thinking, what do I need to do to find my scene, to find the group of writers that are going to help me and propel me forward. I think I'm a little biased, but I think it's a really good resource for that. So check it out for sure.
Well, David, it's been a pleasure speaking to you as always. Always love when we get a chance to catch up and I get to learn all your world because you're speaking, you're writing, you're podcasting, you're doing all these really cool things. Thanks so much for coming on today and for sharing your insights.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.